New Testament 21, Acts 21, will be starting here in just a few moments as we continue to read, consider, and investigate the story of God's people as the Church of Christ, the body of Jesus, begins to fill with souls who are seeking the kingdom. This section right here deals more so with Paul and some of the conversations that take place in the process of his inevitable capture, which is very soon, and imprisonment at the hands of first Jewish authorities. He's transferred into Roman hands, and then it goes through the rest of his story as the scriptures record it for us. Before we get into that, though, right now, if you would bow with me in prayer, and we will begin our study together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the blessings that we share in Jesus. We thank you for the opportunity that is before us with the Bible, open before our eyes, that we open our hearts to its message, that we consider the examples of disciples who have walked before us, that we listen to the inspired record and testimony of these believers in a way that enrich our faith. Help us to be good servants. Help us to be willing to grow. And this is our prayer in the name of your Son. Amen. All right, so as I've kind of quickly summarized before we got into the heart of our class this morning, we're going to begin looking at a section where Paul, in this case now, meets with elders in Jerusalem. So we've had this happen a couple of times where Paul has returned or connected with a community of Christians in a local area, and he does one of two things, which is a counterpoint to his earlier arrival in a city. So if you were to ask this question, hey, when the Apostle Paul goes to a new city, what do you think the first thing he'll do is? What do you think your answer is to that question?
Synagogue.
Synagogue. If you've read the book of Acts and you've kept notes, the answer is he'll try to go to a synagogue. If there is no synagogue, what's his next step? There's a Bible example of this a couple times.
Find out where people are meeting together for praying, kind of on the river or wherever you find out.
Yeah, it seems the next thing he did as a incident, this is not a factual, there's a command to do this. This is an observation. He goes and says, hey, there's people to pray here. I'm going to go talk to them. I'm going to go participate. He finds a place where, in this case, predominantly women went to pray. What else does he do? There's another instance of Paul's arrival in a city where a synagogue isn't the answer, nor is a place to pray of note in the narrative. And we get one of his great sermons to take place there. Just a general marketplace. Sometimes, and he's moving through that case and condition, and he eventually finds himself moved by what he sees. I've seen that you have a idol, a statue, a representation of every god, even one to an unknown god. And at Mars Hill, he has a statement that says, let me tell you about your unknown god. And so Paul's arrival model seems to be, at least, synagogue, checklist, place to pray, checklist, whatever else works, wherever there are people present, would be our third kind of broad clumping. But it's different when he returns to a place. When he goes back to a location, there's really perhaps two primary options that take place. And what are those two primary options? I've hinted at it a little bit. What does he do sometimes when he returns to a place to check on the spiritual condition of the saints that are there? To meet with all the saints. It seems that in some fashion, form, or way, he connects and engages with the disciples who are in that community. Whether it is to prolong his stay and make sure he gathers with them upon the first day of the week, which was their habit, or in some other context, sometimes he stays longer. He has longer stays on these return visits. But notably, on this phase of his life, this segment of his life, when he returns, there's a classification of service, which has a title to the role in the big realm of what it means to be a disciple. Some people are disciples or saints and and they might be and an elder or and a preacher. He goes and meets disciples who are elders in these communities, and he's done it a couple of times. That's interesting and unique. Let me ask you this question. If you knew that somebody came to the area who was a believer in Christ, and his practice was to first go, hey, I want to go talk to those elders and tell them things. How would you feel about that in a modern context? What's the answer to that?
So, the way things are today, we'd say, I wonder what he's up to.
Yeah, like, what's that guy up to? Why is he coming into our area? And I'll use this intentionally, but I think it's the wrong way to use it, and violating our autonomy and talking to our elders. Because we think autonomy is some sort of shield. If you're autonomous, we use that word sometimes describing local churches, that means you got to stay out of our business because it's our business. But what does the word autonomy, as we tend to use it, actually mean? Do we know what it means? Think it through. You can break it out like it's Latin. It's two words. Auto. Monos. If you're going to do that, it's also Greek too. There's a similar word histories for it. Self-governing. That means, and guess what? You know who else is autonomous? You are. And you ever heard that word used applied to automobiles lately? Autonomous vehicles. Self-driving vehicles. They are independent of a human being directing independent. Realize that someone programmed the machine and there's somebody pressing a button somewhere, but they're not wired in or physically connected by a cable to another thing or by structure. Self-governing means self-governing. It doesn't mean you can't go and say, hey, I don't like what you're doing. Or, hey, I like what you're doing. That doesn't change your self-governance. That just says you get to decide. And the local churches still decide when Paul comes in. And we know that they get to decide, and here's the practical thing, because think back to our earlier text. His warning is, you're going to have problems from inside, not from outside. They decided to be wolves instead of sheep in that illustration. And so they're still absolutely self-governing. Paul had no extended autocratic control over them to make them stay in line. He pleaded with them to stay in line. Now, I'm not saying now that we get to, our goal now is to travel to other areas and go tell people what to do. We also know what the outcome of that would be. If I came to your house and started just telling you how to wash your dishes and to maintain your yard and to take care of your cars, you'd probably be polite and say, well, thank you for that. And then go, I'm going to keep doing it the way that works because that guy doesn't know a thing what he's talking about, right? Most certainly, in some areas. If we're talking about tacos, then we can have a fight and really figure out who's superior knowledge in that area or a few other subjects. But generally speaking, we probably would do it like we would do with any other issue. But here's the thing. Paul has now created a pattern for us to pay attention to where he's shifted. There's two facts we need to pay attention to about that. One, it might say something about what Paul's life is like right now, but it also actually shows that these churches have matured. They have matured to the point where they have accomplished what he assigned as a side task of great importance to Titus and Timothy. There are now elders who are shepherding these groups. That's a sense of maturity, right? That means they have men who have reached or already had these criteria and qualities of lives. The churches now have their separatance and guidance, and so that's taking place, and that's a good thing. That also kind of shifts our understanding of what's going on, because he says, look, you're responsible, you're accountable. That includes the church here at Jerusalem, which is the most calendar old of the local churches, right? If you're going to go to the physical calendar, it's been around the longest, right? But the time frame between then and now isn't that huge. We're not talking hundreds of years, right? short period of time. But we also know some things about it. We've seen their work. We realize that it is predominantly Jewish. The chances of it having any kind of significant Gentile presentation in it is slim, but not to none, because you're going to have individuals like Paul himself who have a kind of a split background where ethnically he has a strong connection to Judaism, but regionally he grew up in a way that gave him Roman citizenship by birth, not by purchase. And so that's going to have us think about that, and there'll probably be others who would be part of this group that could fit into that space. And so Paul wasn't alone in his citizenship according to history. All right. There's also some things to pay attention by the way in which Paul is received. First time Paul went to the church at Jerusalem, how did they think of him? Well, this time they did, right? But go back to the first time. Yeah. They received him not is a way to keep it in your brain. So first time, they received him not. Second time, they received him gladly. Because the first time, you're like, we know who you are. We know your business. We know what you've done. In fact, they knew very poignantly whom he was. He had made it a point to try to figure out who they were. And very difficult and painful aspects and segments. And there's two different phases of his work here. Paul's the same person. He's matured. His work has matured. Because the last time this encountering is recorded for us in our initial look at him, he hadn't engaged in what Jesus told him to do. He was about to. He had kind of begun the work. He had already done some teaching and preaching. He had gained the confidence of Barnabas in that process. But now there's a different mood or setting with his return. Let's read a little bit of what we have going on here. Let's just break it up roughly into two halves just for convenience sake. Roy, could you read for us this morning? Are you ready to read back there, Roy? Could you read verses 15 to, say, 21 in chapter 21? And then over on this side, Justin, could you read for us over here and read 22 through 26 after Roy? That's Acts 21, verses 15 to 21, and then 22 to 26.
And when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying in the temple and saying,
Hold on, that's I think you're one chapter ahead there. It should be Acts 21.
You said 21:15? Oh, Acts.
Acts 21:15.
Okay. Now I got the wrong book here. I got Matthew.
That also would be a challenge.
And after those days, we took up our carriage and went up to Jerusalem. There went with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea, and brought with them one Mason of Cyprus, an old disciple with whom we should lodge. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they had heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brethren, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. You said to 21?
Yeah, through 21.
And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after their customs.
What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourselves along with them and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment, that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them. And he went to the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them.
All right, so there's a lot that's packed into this statement from these elders. Now, and there's a couple of stages of this dialogue that take place that kind of lead us to us. So, first and foremost, we have to recognize that this is most clearly a simple condensed version of whatever it was that took place fully. There's no doubt that what we're getting here is the minutes of the meeting that kind of just say, here's what happened. Because we don't know the details of the conversation because it just says, Paul told them. That means whatever right there is Paul recapping the work that he's done. And so there's a synopsis, if you will, of that larger message, whatever it was. It was important enough that it's recorded for us, that we know that that was a conversation point, but we don't get to get Paul's version of the events. Instead, we have Luke's version of the events. And that's the one that we can kind of figure out what went on. Secondly, it makes a connection to prior discussions, which kind of seems obvious. Hadn't we already read from Luke about this letter? Like, do we know the contents of the letter that was sent to the churches of the Gentiles from earlier readings in Luke's research and work in the book of Acts? Where a letter is sent to yeah, we know basically what's in there, right? We know the basic arguments. So Luke's inclusion of this here is a connector, but it's a curious thing because we know about it already. Luke has most recently included the details of that event already there, but it's restated here. And it's restated in a way to help us understand that the problem that was in the Gentile churches has a form of it in this local church. Because it's a very similar problem, right? The problem isn't that much different than the other one, except now it's the other half of the coin. And imagine, if you will, what it would be like to have a culture that is very structured in how the cultural aspects of your faith are manifested. And Israel absolutely had a strong culture on top of the clear biblical doctrines that were included in the law, right? And there were certain ways they did things. So with that kind of connecting piece, can you imagine how challenging it would be if you get a convert to Jesus who's, say, I don't know, 17, and you have a convert to Jesus who is, say, 70? Think back to when you were 17. How likely were you to quickly change a cultural practice if it was no longer necessary versus now? Because how many years have you done the same thing? Well, when you're 17, all of your cultural practices are whatever was done in your house. Pretty much. We do it this way because that's the way mom and dad did it. But 17-year-olds also have a habit of saying, I'm going to do it my way. Because that's normal, right? But you get a 67-year-old who's accustomed to doing the same thing every way. 70-year-old, 75-year-old. How many of us who are 50 and up, I can include myself at 50, I'm on the bar now, are easy adopters of a new structure or a new habit? And we're not good at that, right? In fact, we're bad at it. If the cultural aspect has the appearance of a root in righteousness, doesn't mean there actually needs to be one, but the appearance of one. You're going to watch that 17-year-old and that 70-year-old stare across the room at each other and go, move first, right? It's like a showdown at the OK Corral at that point to see who's going to adjust their perspectives. So it's not surprising that they have this scenario played out where the older Paul, with roots in cultural Israel, is sent to the temple with what seems to be a spectrum of men representative of what these elders have determined is the right localized answer to this problem. Say, Paul, we need you to help us out with this. You need to come and demonstrate that the erroneous parts of this accusation aren't factual. That you're not telling everybody to just willy-nilly abandon everything we know. And Paul's submissive response is pretty strong. As Luke records it, how much kickback does Paul have to this? Is there any kickback? No, not at all. In fact, he just said, okay, we're going to go do this, and they go do this. Now we can, and we will, if we afford ourselves the time, kind of dig through the details of what's going on there. But this is a solve to a problem that is consistently generational. And it's one that will never, ever go away. We're always going to have, in essence, layers of this same problem of sorting through tradition and how it fits into our faith, sorting through the tellings or commands of God, which some of them are referred to as tradition, and individual liberty and our personal autonomy, self-governance, in sight of our King and Creator. Because you can still answer the question, were they required to go to the temple by Christ as disciples of the King to worship God in the new kingdom? As far as we know, the answer to that is no. There's no requirement as a follower of Jesus to go to the temple, right? But there are some caveats to that. If you had made a vow to go to the temple, if you had given your yes and say, I will go to the temple, are you now required to go? Yeah. If you had submitted yourself to one of the cultural vows that used to have perhaps even a strong root in the law, are you required to keep your vow? Yeah. It's actually not that structurally different than the cultural issue of Gentile disciples and wearing a veil or wearing a hat when you pray. Because realize something, gentlemen, we take our hats off of respect, right, for prayer. But have you ever prayed with your hat on? I hope so. Here's why. Because there's probably times when you've had your hat on and something happened and you need to pray right then, and you prioritize prayer over taking your hat off. We do it because it's respectful and it's the right choice and it's cultural in our community and setting to say that's what we're going to do, and we do it. We don't even think about it because it's entrenched in our mindset. Just like most of us who are my age and older, you go inside a building, what does your hat do? Even when you're having a bad hair day. Like, and it's off. Because that's what we know, that's what we do. You know, that's just how it is. And if you're maybe 40 and younger, 30 and younger, unless you served in the military, you go inside a house, building, hat stays on. And it's fine. Even if it bothers me, it's still fine. Just like it bothers me if a hat goes backwards. If you're not welding, bill goes forward, right? But that's me. That's not a rule. These are traditions. Just like the wearing of the veil in Corinth was a tradition and a strong one regarding submission and marriage. And so they are recognized in that local context in a way that helps us understand God's grander expectations. And they've done that way here. So now we got to kind of like stop for a second and say, okay, that's what's happened. This is our survey of the events. We've read through the text, and now we get to ask questions, if you will. So when you read through this, either at home or this morning, when you think about this conversation, what are some of the things that you noticed of import or interest to you? You look at it and you go, like, what's going on here? Or, that's important to me. I've got one I'm going to lead with that kind of fits this space that I found interesting in the reading of the text. And that is, how many thousands of Jews have believed? That statement there in verse 21 there of the text. It kind of includes this idea of the size of the community of disciples in Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem is a metropolitan, large community. If you include what we consider Jerusalem, it's a lot of people, not just Jews. And that lot of people, is narrowed down that we've got thousands. And we already know some of them, right? Remember, this includes people who were present at Pentecost, thousands, and a couple of other opportunities to preach, a couple thousands now, but they don't necessarily all stay in Jerusalem. At different points between then and now, they return home, they disperse. This includes potentially new disciples too, who are post-Pentecost. And I found that interesting, that they're still saying there's thousands here. And the footprint of Jerusalem in the first century is much smaller than it is now, although it still is a very populous community. And so they're going to know each other, interact with each other in ways that are unfamiliar to us. How many of you lived in a community where you can say there are thousands of Christians? Remember, Israel is small and Jerusalem is footprint small. Thousands. I know it would be tough for me to contemplate the full picture of thousands of disciples in Oregon, because some of us live in Oregon and there's churches are sparse there. And I'm even being generous to the idea of trying to figure out disciples I don't know and disciples who might be isolated in a way that they are found within communities of believers that I'm not comfortable with. New disciples, growing disciples, disciples who haven't yet even committed themselves to Jesus in a way that says, I'm willing to be baptized. People are disciples, but not yet adopted, because that's a thing that the Bible uses, that you can be a disciple of Jesus, but not yet be adopted into the kingdom. And that's a pretty common question, because fundamentally, when we think about the Bible as a primitivist who's like saying, I just want to do what the Bible explains, there's a large community of people who say they believe in Jesus. But thousands. So even how you stretch it, it's a difficult thing to picture. But they say, yeah, thousands. Different world, right? Start thinking about it. Maybe it shouldn't be so different. Maybe we've got to figure out a way to make it that way for us and have closer connection to our brethren. Because if we included the churches of the metro area in Atlanta, we can quickly get to a couple thousand believers if you actually started doing the math. Problem is, you got to go across Atlanta to get to the rest of them. So that's like going across the Jordan 3 times and maybe the far part as well. Like, it feels that far. That's a long way, by the way. So that was one of the things that struck me. What about you guys? Or questions or things that you're interested in about this text and observations? Rich?
I like when Paul is relaying all the things he's done to the Gentiles, that they glorify God. So, I mean, that's got to be encouraging and joyous, and just hearing what's happening and that they're actually excited and joyful about it.
Yeah. And it's important to pay attention to the opportunity for us to develop our own ability to rejoice. Over the years, you will eventually have a negative interaction with someone. Like, that's just life. And then over the years, that person will probably be successful in teaching someone the gospel. Like, that's probably going to be happening. And think about what goes on here. Paul had a negative history as an initial outbreak of relationship with this group. It has come completely full circle that not only do they accept him or tolerate him in their midst, they rejoice and glorify towards God because of the work that is being done through his service. And that's a powerful opportunity for us to be self-reflective and think about how we see others, see ourselves. It's super easy to be judgmental. Like, that's actually easy. It's super challenging to glorify God in absence of self-judgment. And saying, here's the way to think about it. Take your favorite hobby, the one that you're the very best at, and imagine the person who had criticized you about your favorite hobby, like why you like that, why you're interested in it, all of a sudden becoming really good at it, and so good they're more effective at it than you are. And they actually are now notable because they do the thing that you do, but maybe they're better at it. Well, they're not only better at it, they've been blessed to be more effective with it, independent of how polished, accomplished, or good they are at it. Because if you can take it in that secular sense, now you can kind of see it a little bit in the spiritual sense. And that's a great opportunity for us to understand more about ourselves, but also about Paul and these brethren there. Because it seems like they actually have a real relationship, not just a surface one. What else do you guys see there or note? I've got a couple more key components before we get to our standard type questions of value or of note to you. Rich? Oh, that's fine.
So he uses the word in verse 21. He talks about what Paul is telling the Gentiles, telling them to forsake Moses and to not circumcise their children. So it seems to me that can be kind of sticky when you're dealing with folks in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Forsaking Moses, and I think that's almost kind of an unfortunate word, forsake, because we use Moses to learn from. So I think it's just in the wording in there, I think it's interesting.
Well, a lot of these wordings are accommodative to try to bring Greek into English, but they're actually intentional. So the translation is accommodative. The Greek, we would say, is authoritative to its fullest possibility, but not supplanting God as the sense of authority. Here's something interesting that we may not always recognize. When we think about the Pharisees, how do we think about them? There's a end game to this in a second. Pharisees are good or bad? What's your answer to that?
Bad.
Right. We tend to think of them on the basis of the few we interact with as being the bad people. They're the bad ones. Here's the reality. Did Jesus ever praise them? He actually did. He says, do what they say, not what they do. Right? Super powerful. Like, hey, their message is good. What's the problem is they're not living up to it. Here's two other tidbits. Number one, if you're talking about the segments of Judaism in the first century, Pharisees are the winners of the theological conflict amongst Judaism. And that Pharisees post-first century is essentially saying Jews. And even actually about this post-Jesus, you might just say, that's Judaism. So the group that we call Pharisees post 55 to 75 AD-ish, are basically just all Jews. Theologically, that becomes the standard of Orthodox Judaism for a very long time. And it's equivalent. So basically saying someone's a Pharisee is calling someone a Jew in modern parlance 100% of the time. Furthermore, many of the disciples who were in the first century, are they themselves Pharisees? Because we see them in the first century churches in our New Testament Bibles. And they're still called that. And their understanding of a couple things is spot on. Questions about the resurrection, questions about what to do when they tell you what to do. Jesus says, hey, they're right. They don't live up to it. They live beyond it, but they're still, by Jesus' standard, right. In fact, their problem is that problem right there. And that's not all of them. It's only the limited number of that group that we get to see. We see a few of them, not all of them. And even Paul himself has a background in that same space. And he had that same problem. His conscience was hardened to the things that he needed to accept, even though his message on some levels actually was really in tune with the expectations of the law. He himself being a Pharisee. So maybe our perception isn't grounded in the fuller picture of what happens going down the road. So now you think about this question of being zealous for the law, zealous for the things of Moses. Seems to be that as a practice culturally, circumcision won. Because how much of the civilized, and I say that very loosely, world circumcises its children before the 8th day? Well, the Western world, particularly in America as a construct, pretty high, right? It's not exclusive, but we do it for non-religious reasons. We do it under the premise of there's potential health benefits and lifetime care benefits of doing it, based on research and all those things, and culture, because this is what we do. Not because of the law, but its practice originates from not only Israel, but also other Mesopotamian cultures, because Israelites weren't the only one to circumcise. Egyptians did it too, to a lesser degree, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's other factors that draw in there. Furthermore, how many of us complained when there was questions of whether or not the Ten Commandments should be present in courts, and they were starting to take some of those down? Why are they doing that? My biggest complaint was architecture, because all that stuff looks cool. And you start scrubbing all that architecture down, I got an issue, because I would much rather them actually follow most of those principles than just have them on the wall. Hey, let's follow these things rather than just having them on the wall and understand them. I'd rather that, if those are my options. Do I have to have them on the wall or in your heart? Well, I'd rather them in your heart, if that's my choice. But also architecturally, these look great. They're cool. And I don't like scrubbing history in that way. We should learn from it and embrace it, and it enriches us. So we have those things that are going on there. But they're still making this accusation about Paul forsaking the law of Moses. And let's think about it. In his teaching, does Paul reset the understanding of what the law does in his teaching? Absolutely he does, to a degree. He says we have to have the law to get where we're at. It was our schoolmaster to bring us to Jesus. But what he has done is said that Jesus is the completion, the fulfillment of that. And look, if it's fulfilled, then its purpose is served. And now what? We have identified ourselves as a culture through our entire history as being distinct because we are followers of Moses. And yet, now what? And so there is a solid truth underneath the accusation, but like most accusations, just like the devil's, the words have been shifted a degree to have a different tone to them. And we're all used to that, right? If you watch the news today and you watch the same news story on two different platforms, it's like you had two different events. And basically what they've done is incentivize the audience who pays their bills. It doesn't matter. Like you pick one. And then it doesn't matter where you get your news. If you get it from the dirt, from YouTube, from a corporate sponsored television show, or from your neighbor, all you are are biased, just like you are. And so you have that same thing going on where we have to make sure we're filtering this out. Paul's participatory solution eradicates the false bias. Because the false bias was he's saying, you don't have to follow any of this. And Paul just like, doop-a-doop. Okay. And don't forget, our Gentile heritage convert who is now in Christ, but had not been circumcised, what does that guy do? High bar of individual submission. And so I want to kind of connect this, that Paul here has submitted himself to these outside elders. They're not his shepherds. He's not a part of the flock of Jerusalem in one day, is he? But they submit to the chief shepherd. And so Paul submits there, just as Titus and Timothy had submitted in other ways, not circumcision exclusively, to the advice and admonition of Paul. So there's a great chain there that kind of works through. Does that begin to answer the question, Rich? Sometimes you get kind of, well, I get off topic a little bit with my things.
It's basically because it left Paul with a better opportunity to teach people.
Yeah, Paul's methodology in there is, if I do this, will it open a door? It seems that's a consistent thing. Like, if I make this decision, if I suppress this right that I have a right to be free. I'll stay in chains if the gospel is advocated. I have a right to leave because God has opened the wall of the prison and cut down my chains. I choose to stay because God needs me to be here. I go to the temple. Now, there's a thing that we have to pay attention to. How many of you, while watching a television show or a movie, are aware when the music changes and all of a sudden gets scary? Even though what's happening on the screen isn't scary yet. You get anxious when that happens? That's planned and designed. What's happening is there's key changes going on in the music. Even though the melody might have stayed the same, they've gone from major keys to minor keys, from minor keys to more complicated chord structures to make you go, I'm feel right. So, if we had a soundtrack for the book of Acts, realize that right now, the backing track, the tone has gone from a major key to a minor key. Because Paul seems pretty content to go to the temple right here, right? I'll go there. What happens next? Is we have a 3-step process that Luke has laid out for us. Step 1. I am ready to die. I am ready to be captured. I am ready to go to jail. Why are you telling me not to go to Jerusalem? Because God wants me to go there. In fact, I need to go there. That just happened, right? So in the arc of storytelling, we now have a little bit of backstory and the potential for a climax staged in the writing of Luke. Doop-a-doo. Hey, I'm in Jerusalem. Because the scene did shift. Now, you have Paul there, sitting there, talking to the disciples, relating his past great works. Paul, you're a great guy. You've done these great things. And God is greater than all of us. That's awesome, too. We like you, Paul. I like you, James. You guys are doing good work. I like you, elders. Hey, let's go to the temple. Okay. That's how it's kind of structured there. And then foreboding, he goes to the temple. Think back narratively. This is our last thing. I think our time is almost up here. Jesus is triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus, you're so great. We're going to lay down palm leaves and you're going to ride a donkey. Big deal. Donkeys, that's royal stuff there. It's better than a Frisian big monster horse, as we would think, royal people are going to ride these big, awesome horses. They're huge. No. You're going to ride a donkey. The animal of the princes and kings. And so, boom, Jesus goes in. We love you. Hey, let's go to the temple. And then it's all downhill after there. All righty then, that's it for our class this morning. We'll continue in our studies next Sunday as we move forward in the story of